The foundation beneath. You live on sand. Not metaphorically. Literally. The building you occupy, the road outside, the device in your hand, all of it rests on sand transformed. Concrete is sand and stone held together by cement. Glass is sand melted and reshaped. Microchips are etched from silicon extracted from high-purity sand. The physical architecture of modern civilization is built from processed granules of silicon dioxide, aggregated and distributed across continents. And it is running out. Not everywhere. Not all at once. But in the specific forms and locations where industrial civilization needs it most. This is not about beaches disappearing, though they are. This is about the material foundation of development itself becoming constrained by supply, by geography, by the physics of what makes sand usable. The world consumes approximately 50 billion tons of sand and gravel annually. Only water is extracted from the earth in greater volume. Construction accounts for the vast majority of this demand. Every kilometer of highway requires 30,000 tons. A single nuclear power plant, 12 million tons. An average-sized house, 200 tons. Concrete alone binds sand into nearly every structure humanity builds, and global concrete production exceeds 4 billion tons per year. The assumption of abundance comes from visibility. Sand appears limitless because deserts cover continents and coastlines stretch for thousands of kilometers. But this is an illusion of category. Not all sand is usable. Desert sand, shaped by wind into fine, rounded grains, does not bind effectively in concrete. The sharp, angular particles required for construction come primarily from riverbeds, floodplains, and coastal zones, environments that are geographically finite and ecologically active. This distinction is not trivial. It is the difference between landscape and resource. Dubai, surrounded by desert, imports sand from Australia. The Burj Khalifa, the tallest structure on Earth, was built with sand sourced externally because local material lacked the structural properties required. What appears abundant from altitude becomes scarce under specification. The engine of extraction. Demand follows urbanization. In 2007, for the first time in history, more than half of humanity lived in cities. By 2050, that proportion is projected to reach 70%. Urban expansion in Asia, Africa, and Latin America drives construction at scales previously unrecorded. China used more cement between 2011 and 2013 than the United States used during the entire 20th century. India's urban population is expected to add 400 million people by 2050. Each new resident requires infrastructure. Each structure requires sand. This creates a supply problem that extends beyond geology. Rivers transport sand downstream as part of their natural sediment flow. Extraction disrupts this process. Mining from riverbeds lowers water tables, destabilizes banks, and accelerates erosion. Remove enough material, and bridges lose their foundations. River channels deepen and widen. Coastal zones, deprived of sediment replenishment, begin to erode. Vietnam's Mekong Delta, one of the most sand-mined regions globally, is losing land to the sea. Sediment that once nourished agricultural floodplains and buffered coastlines now ends up in construction sites in Ho Chi Minh City and beyond. The Delta, home to 20 million people, is sinking. Not because of sea level rise alone, but because the ground itself is being removed. India extracts sand from rivers at rates that exceed natural regeneration by orders of magnitude. The Ganges, the Yamuna, the Nirmada, all have become industrial quarries. In some regions, riverbed mining has dropped water tables so severely that wells have run dry. Ecosystems dependent on sediment flow collapse. Fish populations decline. Floodplain fertility diminishes. Coastal sand mining accelerates beach erosion. Indonesia has lost dozens of small islands to extraction and erosion combined. Singapore, a city-state with almost no natural resources, has expanded its landmass by 25% through land reclamation projects that require vast quantities of imported sand. It purchased so much from neighboring countries that Indonesia, Malaysia, and Cambodia eventually banned exports. The demand did not disappear. It shifted to illegal networks. The invisible market. Sand is cheap. But at industrial volumes, cheap becomes valuable. A billion-dollar market exists for construction-grade sand, much of it unregulated. In India, illegal sand mining operations are controlled by networks that function as mafias. Journalists investigating these networks have been killed. In 2013, environmental activist Palaram Chauhan was murdered after campaigning against illegal mining in Madhya Pradesh. He was not the first. He was not the last. Regulation exists but enforcement does not scale with demand. Permits are issued, then ignored. Inspectors are bribed or threatened. Extraction happens at night, on weekends, in zones marked protected. The material is sold into legal supply chains, where its origin becomes untraceable. A construction company purchases sand from a distributor who purchased from a middleman who purchased from miners operating without oversight. The building goes up. The riverbed does not recover. Morocco exports sand to Europe and the Middle East. Its coastline erodes at rates measured in meters per year. Sandbanks that once protected fishing villages disappear. Storms reach farther inland. Fishermen lose access to traditional grounds as coastal geography shifts. This is not confined to developing economies. In the United Kingdom, marine sand dredging off the coast has raised concerns about erosion and habitat destruction. In the United States, beach nourishment projects, attempts to restore eroded coastlines, require offshore sand extraction, which disrupts marine ecosystems. The demand loop is global. The consequences are local but cumulative. The limits of substitution. There is no replacement for sand in concrete. Recycled concrete can provide some aggregate, but it degrades with each processing cycle and cannot meet the volume or quality standards of natural sand. Manufactured sand, crushed rock processed to mimic natural grains, can substitute in some applications, but it requires energy-intensive crushing and often produces inferior bonding compared to river sand. Desert sand can be treated. Researchers have developed processes to roughen grain surfaces, making them suitable for construction. But these methods are expensive and not yet viable at industrial scale. The economics do not support mass adoption when natural sand remains cheaper, even as it becomes scarcer. Glass production depends on silica sand with purity levels above 95%. Only a fraction of global sand deposits meet this standard. Microchip fabrication requires even higher purity. These are not commodities that can be sourced from any quarry. They depend on specific geological formations, concentrated in specific regions. Industrial supply chains are built around these deposits. Disruption to access creates cascading vulnerabilities. Concrete production is responsible for approximately 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions, primarily from cement manufacturing. Expanding the industry to meet projected demand would increase emissions unless fundamental changes occur in how cement is produced. Sand scarcity intersects with climate policy. Substitution is not only a material challenge. It is an emissions challenge. The question of visibility. Sand does not appear in geopolitical briefings. It does not dominate commodity markets the way oil or rare earth elements do. It is not discussed as a strategic resource. Yet the dependencies are structural. Every megacity, every infrastructure project, every urbanization target depends on continuous sand availability. Remove that availability, and construction costs rise. Projects delay. Development slows. Singapore's dependence on imported sand has created diplomatic tension with its neighbors. When Indonesia and Malaysia restricted exports, Singapore turned to Cambodia, which began exporting millions of tons annually despite limited domestic supply and inadequate environmental protections. Cambodian rivers and coastlines bore the extraction costs. In 2017, Cambodia also banned sand exports. Singapore now sources from Myanmar, where oversight is even weaker. This is not geopolitics in the conventional sense. It is resource dependency expressed through infrastructure and development timelines. Nations do not fight wars over sand. They rearrange supply chains. They intensify extraction elsewhere. They pass environmental costs to regions with less regulatory capacity. China's Belt and Road Initiative, a trillion-dollar infrastructure program spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe, requires sand at volumes that dwarf historical precedent. Where that sand comes from, and what ecosystems are disrupted in the process, is a question largely unexamined in policy discussions. The scale of construction proceeds. The material arrives. The origin is background detail. The weight of the invisible. Modern development operates on the assumption of material availability. Planners design cities. Engineers calculate load capacities. Economists project growth. None of these models incorporate sand scarcity as a constraint because sand has never been constrained. It has always been there, in the quantities needed, at the prices expected. That assumption is eroding. Not suddenly. Not visibly. But in the widening gap between demand curves and sustainable extraction rates. In the riverbeds that no longer regenerate sediment. In the coastlines that retreat faster than models predicted. In the illegal mining networks that fill the space regulation cannot. Imagine cities designed around material limits rather than growth projections. Imagine construction slowing not because of economic downturns but because the physical foundation cannot be sourced sustainably. Imagine infrastructure plans revised not by policy but by geology. These are not distant hypotheticals. They are emerging constraints in regions where extraction has outpaced replenishment for decades. The consequences take time to manifest because sand moves slowly. Rivers recover over timescales measured in centuries, if they recover at all. Coastal erosion is incremental until it is catastrophic. The global construction industry does not yet treat sand as a finite resource. It treats it as an input, reliable and abundant. That treatment has held because extraction has always expanded to meet demand. New rivers have been mined. New coastlines accessed. New suppliers found. But geography is not infinite. The rivers that remain are increasingly protected, or increasingly depleted, or increasingly contested. The material that built modern civilization is becoming the material that constrains it. Not through dramatic collapse. Through incremental tightening. Through rising costs and longer supply chains and environmental damage that accumulates in ecosystems too diffuse to defend effective. This is not a crisis that announces itself. It is a crisis that compounds, quietly, across decades, in the foundations of everything built and everything planned. The world continues to grow. The cities continue to rise. And beneath it all, the sand continues to disappear. What remains is the question no development model has answered: what happens when the most abundant resource becomes scarce not because it is gone, but because accessing what remains costs more than the structures it builds? The foundation is still there. But the ground beneath is shifting. And no one is watching.